The dust of Redemption Bluff tasted of grit and forgotten histories. It settled in the creases of a man's soul, a fine red powder of regret. Sam Ness knew the taste well. He stood in the cool, tomb-like silence of the Redemption Savings and Loan, and the scent of oiled wood and old paper, a stark contrast to the scorched air outside. He was here for a loan, a simple transaction to buy a dozen head of cattle and shore up the fence line before the summer heat baked the plains to a crisp. A quiet life. That was the promise he'd made to Anna, a promise whispered over her grave, a promise he intended to keep for his daughters Lucy and Hope. The bank teller, a nervous man named Miller, with spectacles perched on a perpetually sweating nose, was counting out a small stack of bills when the double doors swung inward. They didn't slam. They moved with a chilling, deliberate grace. 3 men entered, their long dusters swirling around their boots like shrouds. The 2 flanking men were brutes, and their faces hard and unthinking shotguns held with casual menace. But the man in the center was different. He was tall and slender, his movements fluid. He wore a tailored black coat, immaculate despite the dust, and his face, framed by dark, silver-streaked hair, was handsome in a severe, predatory way. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His presence sucked the air from the room. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that seemed utterly alien to this rough-hewn town. "My associates and I will be making a small, unscheduled withdrawal. Your cooperation will ensure this remains a simple matter of commerce." Sam's body went rigid. Every instinct, long buried and deliberately starved, screamed at him. The weight of a phantom gun belt settled on his hips. He was a rancher, now a father, not the man he used to be. He forced himself to stay still, to become part of the woodwork, just another terrified citizen. The leader's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept the room. They passed over the trembling Miller, the frozen customers, and then they locked onto Sam. There was a flicker of something in their depths, not surprise, but a cold, terrible recognition. The man smiled, a precise, bloodless curving of his lips. "Well, well," he murmured, stepping forward. "Samuel Ness. It seems Providence has a flair for the dramatic." Sam's blood ran cold. He knew this man. Not his face, not his name, but the chilling cadence of his speech, the calculated cruelty in his eyes. He was the ghost of a life Sam had fought to escape. The leader, Silas Kane, gestured for his men to empty the till. He, however, walked directly to Sam, his boots making no sound on the floorboards. He stopped a foot away, his gaze dropping to Sam's neck. "That's a fine piece of silver," Silas said, his voice soft. He wasn't looking at Sam's face, but at the small, tarnished locket that hung from a leather cord. It was Anna's. The only thing he had left of her besides the girls. "It's nothing," Sam said, his own voice a gravelly rasp. "Just a trinket." "Oh, I disagree." Silas replied, his smile widening. He reached out his gloved fingers, impossibly delicate, and took the locket between them. "Some things are priceless. Memories, for instance. A memory is a fragile thing, Mr. Ness. So easily misplaced." With a flick of his wrist, he snapped the leather cord. Sam flinched as if struck. The locket was gone from his neck, nestled in Silas Kane's black-gloved palm. "This will serve as a service fee," Silas said, his eyes glittering, a reminder of old debts. He turned his men, already backing toward the door with sacks of money. "Do give my regards to the children." The doors swung shut and they were gone. For a moment, the bank was utterly silent, save for Miller's whimpering. Sam stood frozen, his hand at his throat where the locket used to be. It was more than a robbery. It was a violation, a message carved into his soul. The past wasn't buried. It had just come back to dig him up. Outside, the chaos erupted. A stagecoach, its arrival timed with perfect misfortune, was just pulling to a halt in front of the saloon. Silas's men fired a single shot into the air, and the horses reared in terror. Passengers screamed. One of the brutes tore open the coach door, yanking baggage onto the dusty street. A woman was thrust out, stumbling and falling to her knees. She wore a simple brown dress and a straw bonnet that had been knocked askew. Her face was pale with shock, her hands clutching a worn gray shawl as if it were her only anchor in the world. This was Rose. She had arrived in Redemption Bluff with a small valise and a heart full of ghosts, seeking nothing more than a quiet place to mend the shattered pieces of her life. Now she knelt in the dust, her meager savings gone a spectator to a violence that echoed the brutal indifference of the fate that had already taken everything from her. Sam stumbled out of the bank, his vision tunneled on the space where Silas Kane had vanished. He saw the overturned luggage, the frightened horses, the woman on the ground. Her eyes, wide and filled with a familiar, hollowed-out grief, met his. In that moment, two strangers, both victims of the same brutal whirlwind, saw their own desolation reflected in the other. Sam's personal hell had just become collateral damage, and the quiet life he had bled for was already turning to ash. The ride home was a silent torment. The bundle of fence wire rattled behind his saddle, a mocking percussion against the roaring in his ears. The sun beat down, but Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The empty space on his chest, where the locket had rested, felt like a fresh wound. He wasn't just a rancher who'd been in the wrong place. He had been a target. "Do give my regards to the children." The words were a brand searing into his mind. The cabin came into view near sundown, a squat house of cedar logs nestled in a crook of the creek, a stand of cottonwoods rustling behind it like old women whispering secrets. The thin puff of smoke from the chimney was a beacon of the life he was failing to protect. As he dismounted, Lucy was there on the porch as he knew she'd be. She was 8, but her eyes held the weary vigilance of someone much older. She stood still as a hawk, her rag doll clutched in one hand, pretending she wasn't looking for him, though she always was. Hope only 4 burst from the door, a whirlwind of blonde curls and untamed energy. "Papa, Papa, you're back!" she shrieked, running headlong into his legs. Sam grunted, forcing a smile that felt like cracking stone. He swung her up into his arms, her small frame, a fragile, precious weight. "Who was in town?" Lucy asked, her voice flat, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You look angry." "Just some trouble at the bank," Sam said, setting Hope down. He couldn't tell them the truth. Not yet. How could he explain that a monster from his past had reached across the years to touch them? Before he could say more, he heard the slow crunch of boots on the road behind him. He turned his hand instinctively, going to his hip, only to find nothing there. It was the woman from the stagecoach, Rose. She carried her small, battered valise, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The gray shawl was wrapped tightly around her, a shield against a world that had offered her nothing but cruelty. She stopped at the edge of his property, her gaze fixed on the ground. I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice thin and raspy. "The stage was robbed. Everything I had was in my trunk. The sheriff said there's nowhere to stay in town until the circuit judge arrives next month." Sam stared at her. He saw the cracked skin around her lips and the fine tremor in her hands. He saw another life shattered by the same storm that had torn through his own. He had no use for strays, not in this world where work was hard, and the 2 mouths he had to feed were already a weight that pressed on him day and night. But Silas Kane had made her his problem. Leaving her on the road felt like leaving a part of himself to perish. "You can stay the night," he heard himself say the words, tasting like rust, The cot by the hearth is empty." Lucy's brown eyes narrowed. "Papa, no," she whispered fiercely, stepping closer. "We don't know her." "She needs a roof," Sam said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Just for tonight." Rose looked up, her eyes pale as a sky just before a storm, filled with a desperate, wary gratitude. She gave a small, jerky nod and followed him inside the screen door, sighing shut behind her. The cabin was plain, a table, 3 chairs, shelves of jars along one wall. Anna's touch still lingered in the woven mats on the floor and the beaded strips tucked away on a high shelf which Lucy dusted with fierce devotion. Hope, ever curious, climbed onto a stool beside the cot where Rose had set her valise, peering at the stranger. Rose sank onto the cot, her body seeming to fold in on itself. Her gaze was unfocused, lost in the trauma of the day. Hope, emboldened by the woman's stillness, reached out a small hand and touched the worn fabric of her shawl. The woman flinched. Her eyes snapped into focus, landing on Hope's small, round face. A raw, guttural sound tore from her throat. "Eli," she sobbed the word, a wound ripped open. Before Sam could move, she wrapped both arms around Hope, pulling the surprised girl into a desperate, crushing embrace. Hope squealed a sound of shock, not fear. Papa, Lucy gasped, rushing forward, her small frame rigid with outrage. Sam crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands firm but not rough, as he eased the woman's arms away from his daughter. "Easy," he said, his voice low. "You're safe here." Rose sagged against the pillow, her body racked with silent tremors. Tears streamed down her face, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She tried to speak, but only broken sounds emerged. Hope wriggled down from the cot, more puzzled than frightened. "Papa, she thought I was somebody else." Sam only nodded, his chest tightening. He knew that kind of grief, the kind that saw ghosts in the faces of the living. Lucy planted herself between the cot and the hearth, a tiny, defiant sentinel. Her eyes never left Rose's face, sharp and guarded. The look was painfully familiar. It was the same one she had given well-meaning neighbors after her mother died. That night, the cabin was thick with an uneasy silence. Sam sat at the table, ostensibly mending a piece of tack, but his focus was on the shadows. Rose lay on the cot, her breathing shallow but steady. The girls whispered in their bed in the corner, Lucy's low tones a constant protective murmur. When the lamp burned low, Sam rose. He pulled the blanket up over Rose's shoulders. His hand brushed against the shawl she still clutched to her chest, a fabric worn thin as paper. He looked at his daughters. Hope had fallen asleep, but Lucy remained watchful, even in drowsiness, her eyes half open, fixed on the stranger in their home. Sam stepped out onto the porch, gazing at the dark line of cottonwoods. The wind had quieted, and the stars were scattered like grains of cornmeal across black stone. The theft of the locket was a declaration of war. Silas Kane hadn't just robbed a bank. He had come for Sam. He had taken Anna's memory as the first blow, and the threat against his children was the promise of a second. The quiet life was over. Emptiness, he had once believed, was safer than hope. But now he knew something far more dangerous had arrived, a reckoning. And it had followed a stranger right to his door. Morning came, not with a gentle stirring, but with the sharp cry of a hawk circling high over the mesas. Inside the cabin, the light was gray and unforgiving. Rose was already awake when Sam stirred the fire, her hands clutching a tin cup of water, the gray shawl draped over her shoulders like a permanent part of her. She hadn't slept. The dark circles under her eyes were stark against her pale skin. Hope was the first to approach her bare feet, padding softly on the wooden floor. "Are you still sad?" she asked, her head tilted. Rose looked at the child, and for a moment the immense grief in her eyes was so profound it seemed to steal the warmth from the nascent fire. She managed a faint, slow nod. Lucy watched from the corner, already dressed, her hair braided with brisk, angry fingers. "Hope, leave her be," she commanded. "Papa, she can't stay. Town is where people go." "The town has nothing for her." Sam said, his voice flat. He was thinking of the locket of Silas's cold eyes. The town was a vulnerability, a place where his past could find him. Having this woman here was a complication, but sending her back felt like sending a lamb into a wolf's den. He didn't know why, but he felt a grim certainty that Silas Kane's business in Redemption Bluff was not finished. Breakfast was a tense affair. The cornmeal mush was thick and tasteless in Sam's mouth. Hope chattered, oblivious, pointing out the chip in her bowl and asking if the stranger had a chipped bowl where she came from. Lucy ate in stiff, pointed silence, her gaze a constant accusation directed at Rose. Rose, for her part, barely ate. She held the spoon, but her hand trembled too much to lift it to her lips. After the meal, she rose without a word and began to gather the bowls. "You don't have to do that." Lucy snapped, her face flushing with a possessive anger. "This is our home." Rose froze, the bowls clutched in her hands. She looked small and broken, a ship foundering in the storm of a child's hostility. "Lucy," Sam warned, his voice low. He laid a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Let her be." The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Rose spoke little, but her hands were never still. She swept, she mended, she weeded the small, struggling vegetable patch by the creek. Each action was quiet, unobtrusive, the work of someone trying to make themselves so small they might disappear entirely. She was paying for her keep, earning her space with a silent, desperate industry. Sam watched her, and he watched the road. He took to carrying his old rifle with him when he mended fences, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, searching for the telltale plume of dust that signaled riders. Silas Kane was not a man to issue an idle threat. The theft of the locket was a beginning. The question was what came next. He spent an afternoon reinforcing the locks on the doors and shuttering the windows more securely, actions that did not go unnoticed by Lucy. "Are you scared of something, Papa?" she asked one evening, her doll held tight against her chest. Just being carefully lied, hating the fear he saw flicker in her eyes. One afternoon, Sam returned to find Rose by the creek, kneeling beside Anna's grave. It was a simple mound of stones under the largest cottonwood, the place where he had buried all his hopes. Rose wasn't weeping. She was pulling the small weeds that had sprouted between the rocks, her movements gentle and respectful. Lucy stood on the porch, watching her small face, a mask of conflict. This was sacred ground, her mother's place, and this stranger was touching it. When Rose came back to the cabin, her hands smudged with dirt, Lucy blocked her path. "You shouldn't have been there," she said, her voice trembling with accusation. Rose looked down at the child, her own face etched with a sorrow that seemed to understand Lucy's perfectly. "I know," she whispered. "I was just tidying. A resting place should be peaceful." She paused, her gaze lifting to meet Lucy's. "I have a place like that too. For my son Eli and his father. I know what it means to keep it safe." The raw honesty in her voice seemed to disarm Lucy. The girl's defensive posture softened slightly. She said nothing more but stepped aside, allowing Rose to pass. That night, a rider came. Not Silas, but one of his brutish thugs. He didn't dismount, just sat on his horse at the edge of Sam's property, a dark silhouette against the blood-red sunset. He said nothing, just watched the cabin for a long, unnerving minute, before turning his horse and galloping away. The message was clear. "We know where you are. We're watching." Sam came inside the screen door, slamming behind him. He looked at Rose, who was helping Hope wash up at the basin, and at Lucy, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. The stranger in his house was no longer just a stray. She was a witness. Another life, entangled in the web Silas was weaving around him. Later, when the girls were asleep, he found Rose on the porch staring out into the star-dusted darkness. The shawl was wrapped tight around her. "You should leave," Sam said, his voice rough. "It's not safe for you here." She turned to him, her expression unreadable in the gloom. "Where would I go? I have nothing. No money, no people. Your town offered me dust and fear. Your home. It's the only roof I have." "There's a man," Sam began the words, tasting like poison. "He has a quarrel with me. He's the one who robbed the bank. He's dangerous." "I saw his eyes," Rose said softly. "I know what dangerous looks like. It looks like a fever that takes your child. It looks like a winter that takes your husband. It looks like an empty road with nowhere to go. I'm not afraid of your quarrel, Mr. Nez. I'm afraid of being alone." Sam fell silent. He looked out at the vast, indifferent darkness of the plains. He had tried to build a fortress of solitude to protect his girls, but the walls were already breached. And now this woman with her own army of ghosts was inside it with him. He didn't know if she was a weakness or improbably a strength. He only knew that sending her away now would be an act of cruelty he couldn't stomach. He went back inside and took a faded photograph from the small wooden box where he kept Anna's things. It showed a younger Anna smiling, standing beside a tall, dark-haired young man with a familiar chilling arrogance in his eyes. He wore a tailored Eastern suit that was out of place against the rustic backdrop of Anna's family farm back east. It was Silas Kane, Anna's estranged brother. The brother she had run from the brother whose possessive cruelty had driven her west in the first place. He finally understood. This wasn't about an old lawman's grudge. This was about family. Silas hadn't come for revenge on a man who'd put his partners away. He'd come for what he believed was his. He blamed Sam for taking Anna from him, and now he was here to take everything Sam had left. The land, the locket, and the children. It was a debt of blood, and Silas Kane had come to collect. The weight of the photograph in his hand was immense. It was a portrait of the devil he now knew by name. Rose had been right. They were all trapped here waiting. The silence in the cabin was no longer one of grief. It was the held breath before a storm. By the fourth morning, the oppressive silence in the cabin had been replaced by a quiet, shared dread. Sam's revelation about Silas Kane had changed everything. Rose was no longer just a refugee. She was an unwilling participant in his family's siege. She now understood the rifle that leaned by the door, for the way Sam's gaze constantly drifted to the horizon. She tried to make herself useful, her hands a constant blur of motion, mending, cleaning, cooking. It was a way to fight back against the helpless terror that threatened to consume them. But it was hope in her innocence who finally broke through the wall of unspoken fear. She sat at the table pushing her mush around her bowl. "My doll's name is Annie," she announced to Rose. "Do you have a doll?" Then, without waiting for an answer, she asked, "Did you ever have a baby?" The spoon clattered from Rose's hand. The air grew taut. Sam tensed, ready to intervene, but Rose held up a hand, a small, trembling gesture. She looked at Hope, her eyes shimmering like fragile glass. "Yes," she whispered, her voice rough with disuse. "I had a baby." "Where is he?" Hope pressed her curiosity pure and unyielding. Rose swallowed her hand, going to the gray shawl as if to physically hold herself together. He's gone." She drew a ragged breath, and the story spilled out of her, the words like stones she had carried for too long. "My boy's name was Eli. He was 5. A fever took him last winter, and 2 months later, my husband Tom followed. The grief took him, I think. I buried them both on a hill where the wind never stopped singing. When the ground froze over, there was no reason left to stay. Her voice cracked on the last words, but she did not weep. The story was told with the flat, exhausted finality of a truth she had recited to herself in the dark 1,000 times. Hope's small face crumpled. She slid from her chair and without a word climbed into Rose's lap, wrapping her thin arms around her neck. Rose gasped a soft broken sound, and then she held the child close, her body trembling violently. Lucy watched her usual suspicion warring with a dawning terrible empathy. She looked from Rose, clinging to her little sister, to her father. His face a mask of stone, his jaw clenched so tight, the muscles stood out like cords. She was beginning to understand that there were other kinds of monsters, besides the ones that rode horses and carried guns. There were the ones that lived inside you. That night, after the girls were asleep, Sam found Rose by the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on her face. You didn't have to tell them that, he said, his voice low. Silence can drown a soul worse than any storm, she answered, her gaze fixed on the flames. I kept it locked away for too long. When your daughter asked, I couldn't lie to her innocence. Sam leaned back, the old wood of his chair creaking. He felt the truth of her words resonate in his own silent heart. My wife, Anna. She died the night Hope was born. A hemorrhage. The doctor was a day's ride away. He had never spoken the words aloud to anyone. Lucy was 6. She stood in the cold by the grave, clutching my hand. I didn't cry. I couldn't. But I've been carrying it ever since. A shared understanding passed between them, a fragile bridge built across an abyss of loss. I thought I was the only one walking with ghosts, Rose whispered. Sam finally met her eyes across the fire. Seems we both are. A few days later, while mending one of Sam's shirts, Rose's needle pricked her finger. As she searched for a spare piece of cloth in his mending box, her fingers brushed against the hard edge of the photograph Sam had looked at days before. She pulled it out. The image was faded, but the faces were clear. A young, vibrant Anna, and beside her, a man whose cold, arrogant eyes she would never forget. It was the man from the bank. The man who had stolen Sam's locket. Silas Kane. She looked at the photograph and then at Sam, who had just entered the cabin. The question was in her eyes, stark and unavoidable. Sam's face hardened. Her brother, he said, the words clipped. Silas Kane. She fled from him years ago. He's possessive. He never forgave her for leaving or for marrying me. The pieces clicked into place, for Rose forming a picture of terrifying clarity. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a vendetta. He's come to take you apart, she breathed, the shirt falling from her lap. Piece by piece. He started with her memory, Sam said, his hand unconsciously going to his throat. He'll come for the land next. It was hers. And then, he didn't need to finish. They both knew what came last. The threat galvanized them. The quiet waiting was over. It was time to prepare. Sam began to teach Rose how to load and fire the old rifle. Her hands shook at first, the weapon heavy and unfamiliar. But as she practiced firing at tin cans set on a fence post, a grim determination settled in her eyes. She was no longer just a victim. She was a defender of this small, fragile sanctuary. Lucy watched the rifle practice from the porch, her face pale. The game of pretend was over. The monster was real. That evening, she crept to Rose's side as she cleaned the rifle. Are you going to kill the bad man? Lucy whispered. Rose paused, the oily rag still in her hand. She looked at the child's fearful face. I'm going to help your father keep you safe, she said, her voice firm but gentle. That's all that matters. The next day, rain came, a steady gray sheet that turned the yard to mud and blurred the edges of the world. It was a blessing providing cover. Under the drumming of the rain on the roof, Sam boarded up the smaller windows, leaving only narrow slits to see through. The cabin became a fortress, a dim protected space against the coming storm. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, but also with a strange, new intimacy. They were bound together, 4 souls against the darkness. Rose told the girls stories of Eli, not with grief, but with a quiet love that made him seem real, a friendly ghost in their besieged home. Lucy, in turn, began to speak of her mother, sharing small, treasured memories. In this cocoon of shared stories and looming danger, Lucy's walls began to crumble. One evening, as Rose was humming a soft, sad lullaby, Lucy leaned her head against her shoulder. It was a small, hesitant gesture, but it was everything. The rain stopped near dawn. As the first pale light broke through the clouds, they saw it. A single black feather, stark against the wet earth, had been thrust into the ground just beyond the fence line. A symbol, a promise. Sam stood on the porch, rifle in his hand, staring at the feather. Rose came to stand beside him, the shawl wrapped around her. "He's toying with you," she said. "He's telling me he can get this close whenever he wants." Sam countered, his voice grim. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that had taken root in her grief-hollowed eyes. He had let her stay out of a grudging pity, a sense of responsibility. But now, as they stood together, facing the coming night, he knew it was more than that. She wasn't just a stray he'd taken in. She was his flank. The days after the black feather's appearance were steeped in a suffocating tension. The world outside the cabin felt predatory. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a man. The strain began to wear on them, especially on Lucy. The fears so long held at bay by her fierce pride began to manifest as a hacking cough. At first it was a minor annoyance, but within a day it had settled deep in her chest. By nightfall, she was burning with fever. She lay curled beneath her quilt, shivering despite the roaring fire. Her breaths were shallow, rattling things. Hope sat by the bed, her small face a mask of worry clutching her sister's limp hand. "Papa," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Lucy's burning up." Sam's face was a grim landscape of fear and helplessness. This was a battle he didn't know how to fight. He could face down a man with a gun, but he was powerless against the invisible enemy consuming his daughter. It was Rose who took charge. "Cool cloths for her head," she said, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the panic in the room. "And we need to get broth into her. We have to keep her strength up." Sam hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Do what you can." That night became a long, desperate vigil. Rose sat by Lucy's bedside, a sentinel against the encroaching darkness. She bathed the girl's forehead with cool, water-coaxed sips of broth between her cracked lips, and whispered soothing words when Lucy cried out in her delirium. "Don't let him take Papa," Lucy muttered, her voice thick with fever. "He's ours. He's all we have." Each word was a knife in Rose's heart. She gently stroked the damp hair back from Lucy's face. "I won't let anyone take him," she promised softly. "I'm here. We're all here. Just rest." When Lucy's shivering became violent, Rose sang. She sang the lullabies she had once sung for Eli, her voice a fragile thread of melody against the howling of the wind outside. It was a song of love and loss, a hymn for all the children she couldn't save, and a prayer for the one she was trying to hold on to now. Sam watched from the shadows, his heart a raw, aching thing. He saw not a stranger, but a woman fighting for his child, with a ferocity born of her own devastating losses. He saw the ghost of her own son in the way she tended to Lucy, a desperate, fierce love that refused to surrender. He had thought her weak a victim, He was wrong. She was a survivor, forged in a fire hotter than any he had ever known. Dawn broke, painting the narrow slits of the windows in pale, hopeful gray. Rose was still there, slumped in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the bed, her hand still loosely holding Lucy's. The fever had not broken. Just as the sun crested the mesas, they heard the thud of multiple horses arriving in the yard. Sam grabbed the rifle, his movements swift and silent. He peered through a crack in the shutters. It was Silas Kane, flanked by his 2 thugs. But he wasn't here for a fight. He sat on his horse, a picture of calm arrogance, and held up a white cloth. A parley. Samuel Ness Silas called, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. I come with a proposition, not one of violence, but of business. Sam's jaw clenched. I have no business with you. Oh, but you do. Silas called back, a cruel smile playing on his lips. I hear your daughter is unwell. The town doctor is a drunk, and the next one is 2 days' ride from here. But as it happens, I have a substantial supply of quinine. A miracle for fevers, they say. He held up a small leather pouch. It's yours. A gift. In exchange for a simple conversation. Just you and me. It was a devil's bargain. A trap laid with the most tempting bait imaginable, his daughter's life. He looked back at Lucy, her face flushed, her breathing a painful struggle. He looked at Rose, her eyes wide with fear, silently pleading with him. Don't, Sam, Rose whispered. It's what he wants. What choice do I have? He rasped the rifle, feeling useless in his hands. He made the decision. He laid the rifle on the table and walked to the door. Stay inside. Bar it behind me, he ordered Rose. He stepped out onto the porch, his hands empty and open at his sides. A conversation, Sam said, his voice flat and hard. Then you give me the medicine. Silas smiled, dismounting with an easy grace. Of course. A gentleman's agreement. He walked toward the porch, stopping at the bottom step, his stormy eyes boring into Sam. The land, Samuel. This piece of dirt you cling to. It was Anna's birthright. It should have been mine when she passed. Sign it over to me and you and your children can walk away. I'll even give you enough to start again somewhere new. Somewhere far away. She fled from you, Sam snarled. This land was her escape. It's all her daughters have left of her. Silas's smile vanished, replaced by a chilling coldness. She fled to you, a mistake she paid for. You with your violent past, your reputation as a man-killer. You pulled her into your world, and it destroyed her. This land is tainted by your presence. I am merely cleansing it. He tossed the pouch of quinine onto the porch. It landed with a soft thud. Consider this a down payment. Think on my offer. I'll be back for your answer. And I do hope, for the little one's sake, you make the right choice. He turned and mounted his horse, his men falling in behind him. They rode away, leaving Sam alone on the porch with the devil's medicine in his hand and an impossible choice tearing him apart. He could lose the land, Anna's legacy, or he could lose his daughter. Silas Kane wasn't just coming for his home, he was coming for his soul. Inside the cabin, Lucy's fever broke by the second day. The quinine worked its bitter magic, and the fire in her veins receded, leaving her weak but lucid. She blinked awake to find Rose asleep in the chair beside her, her face pale and drawn from sleepless nights. For a long moment, Lucy simply stared. The guarded walls she had so carefully built inside herself, stone by stone since her mother's death, crumbled to dust at the sight of this woman, who had refused to leave, who had fought a fever for her while a monster waited outside. You stayed, Lucy whispered, her voice a thread of sound. Rose's eyes fluttered open. She straightened, a weary smile touching her lips. I promised, didn't I? Tears welled in Lucy's eyes. She turned her face to the pillow, but not before Rose saw them. Later that evening, as Rose brought her a bowl of thin broth, Lucy whispered so quietly, Rose almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." Rose bent and kissed the girl's forehead, her own throat tight with emotion. "You're welcome, Lucy." With the immediate crisis of the fever past, the weight of Silas's offer settled over the cabin like a shroud. Sam was a caged animal pacing the floor, his face a mask of tormented indecision. To give up the ranch was to betray Anna's memory. It was the one place she had felt free, the one piece of the world she had truly called her own. But to refuse was to sign his daughter's death warrants. It was during this tense waiting period that Lucy's heart now cracked open, fully surrendered. One afternoon, she crept onto the porch where Rose sat mending a torn shirt. I thought, Lucy began, her small hands twisting in her lap. I thought, if you stayed, Papa wouldn't need us anymore. Rose set aside her needle, her voice gentle. "Oh, Lucy, your father's heart is big enough for all of us. Loving someone new doesn't mean you love the ones you had any less. It just means your heart is making more room." She looked at the girl, her expression full of a deep, sorrowful wisdom. Love isn't a space that gets filled up. It's a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. Lucy's eyes widened, tears brimming. In that moment, she understood. She leaned forward, her arms wrapping fiercely around Rose's waist. "Don't go," she whispered into the worn fabric of Rose's dress. "Please don't go." Rose froze her breath, catching in her throat before she held the child close, her own silent tears falling into Lucy's hair. "I won't," she vowed. "Not if you'll have me." That night, as Sam stood staring out the window at the menacing darkness, Lucy came to his side. Her voice when she spoke was small but certain. "Papa, she took care of me. Like Mama would have." Sam's throat tightened. He looked down at his daughter, then across the room at Rose, who stood by the hearth, her eyes lowered, but shining with unshed tears. He laid a hand on Lucy's head. "I know she did." Lucy looked from her father to Rose, a silent question in her eyes. Then she took a breath and took a step, crossing the space between her and Rose. She stood before her, her expression solemn. And then the word fragile and momentous came. "Mama," Lucy whispered. The single word fell into the silence of the room, shattering it. It was not a question, but a declaration. Rose's hands flew to her mouth, a sob escaping. She sank to her knees and gathered Lucy into her arms, the two of them clinging to each other, weeping with a grief and a joy so profound it was impossible to tell them apart. Sam turned away, his hand gripping the window frame so hard his knuckles turned white. He had not heard that word spoken in his home since Anna died. To hear it now, given so freely, so earned to this woman who had walked into their lives from the dust, it cracked something wide open inside him. Later, after the girls were asleep, Sam and Rose sat in the heavy silence. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. "He'll be back for my answer soon," Sam said, his voice a low rumble. "What will you tell him?" Rose asked, though she already knew. "A man can't trade his soul for safety," he said. "This land is theirs. I won't give it up." "Then we don't give it up." Rose said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "We fight for it. Together." Sam looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the broken woman he'd found on the road, but a partner. Her grief had not destroyed her. It had tempered her into something resilient, something strong. In her eyes, he saw not the reflection of his own loss, but the promise of a shared future if they could survive the coming dawn. "He thinks he's taking us apart piece by piece," Sam murmured, a grim resolve hardening his features. "He doesn't realize he's just been forging us together." The plan was desperate, born of the conviction that to surrender was a fate worse than death. Silas would come for his answer, and he would not come alone. The cabin was a death trap too easily surrounded. Their only chance was to choose the battlefield. The old abandoned silver mine, the Widow's Maw, was a treacherous maze of tunnels and shafts sunk deep into the mesas a few miles north. It was a place the locals avoided, rumored to be unstable and haunted by the ghosts of miners lost to rock falls. It was the perfect place for an ambush. They left under the cover of a moonless night, the cabin dark and empty behind them, a silent invitation to a trap Silas would find sprung. Sam carried a sleeping Hope, while Rose walked beside Lucy, their hands clasped tightly. The air was unnaturally still, thick and heavy with the promise of a storm. By the time they reached the mine entrance, a low, ominous wind was beginning to moan through the canyons. The inside of the mine smelled of damp earth and cold stone. Sam lit a single lantern, its flickering light casting long skeletal shadows that danced on the rough-hewn walls. He found a defensible spot, a small alcove off the main tunnel with a clear line of sight to the entrance, but enough cover to protect them. "You stay here with the girls," he told Rose, handing her his spare pistol. "No matter what you hear, you don't come out. You keep them safe." Rose's eyes were wide in the lantern light, but her hand was steady as she took the gun. "What are you going to do?" "Give him a warmer welcome than he's expecting," Sam said, his face grim. He checked his rifle, the familiar weight, a cold comfort in his hands, and disappeared into the darkness of a side tunnel. They didn't have to wait long. Just as the first drops of rain began to hiss against the rocks outside, Silas and his men arrived. They saw the tracks leading to the mine, and assuming Sam had run like a cornered animal, followed him in. Samuel Silas's voice echoed through the tunnels, oozing with mock sympathy. "There's no need to hide in the dark. Come out and let us conclude our business." The first shot came from the darkness above them. One of Silas's thugs grunted and fell, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The second thug panicked, firing blindly into the shadows. Sam's rifle answered the sound, deafening in the enclosed space, and the second man crumpled to the ground. Silas didn't flinch. He simply melted back toward the mine entrance, using the rock formations as cover. "Impressive, Samuel. The old instincts are still sharp. But you've made a fatal error. You've brought the things you love most into the battlefield." Suddenly, from the alcove, Lucy screamed. One of Silas's other men, one Sam hadn't seen, had circled around through a connecting tunnel. He burst into the alcove, grabbing both girls, his arm tight around their chests. Rose stood frozen, the pistol in her hand, unable to get a clear shot without hitting one of the children. "Drop the rifle, Samuel, or the next sound you hear will be your daughters joining their mother," Silas called, his voice triumphant. The rifle clattered to the stone floor. Sam stepped out of the shadows, his hands raised. The man holding the girls dragged them out into the main tunnel. Hope was crying, but Lucy's eyes were wide with a terrified fury. Silas stepped forward, his own pistol now leveled at Sam's chest. "The deed to the land, Samuel. You'll sign it over, and then as a final act of mercy, I will reunite your family." "Why?" Sam growled, his voice raw with hate. "Why all this? She was your sister." Silas's face contorted, the handsome mask falling away to reveal a twisted, obsessive rage. "She was my sister, mine. Before you poisoned her with your talk of freedom and your life of blood and dirt. She belonged with her family in the East. You stole her from me." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She even knew it in the end. Just before she died, she sent me a letter. A letter begging me to look after her children if anything ever happened to you. To save them from the violent world you dragged them into." He smiled, a terrible, tragic expression. Don't you see I'm not destroying your family, Samuel? I am fulfilling my sister's dying wish. I'm saving them from you. It was then that the world outside exploded. The storm which had been brewing broke with cataclysmic force. A gust of wind howled through the mine entrance, extinguishing the lantern and plunging them into absolute darkness. In the same instant, a sound like thunder rolled through the tunnels, a cascade of falling rocks from a deliberately triggered rock slide at a secondary entrance. It was Rose. In the chaos of the girl's capture, she had slipped away into a side tunnel, her mind racing. She remembered Sam pointing out the unstable shaft earlier. Using all her strength, she had dislodged the rotting support beams, creating the diversion. In the sudden disorienting blackness, confusion reigned. The thug holding the girls loosened his grip for a fraction of a second. It was all Lucy needed. She bit down hard on the man's arm, sinking her teeth in with all her might. He roared in pain, shoving her away. Sam lunged forward in the dark, guided by the sound. He collided with the thug, the two men crashing to the floor. Silas fired his pistol, the muzzle flash, a brief blinding strobe that illuminated the chaos. It also illuminated Rose, emerging from the side tunnel, her own pistol raised. She fired. The shot went wide, but it served its purpose. Silas whirled toward the new threat, giving Sam the opening he needed. He drove his elbow into the thug's throat, silencing him permanently, and scrambled for his rifle. "Mama, look out," Lucy shrieked. Silas fired at Rose. The bullet ricocheted off the rock wall near her head, showering her with stone fragments. She cried out, stumbling back. Sam had the rifle. He rose to one knee, the weapon steady in his hands, the barrel aimed directly at Silas's heart. In the gloom, he could just make out his silhouette. For a heartbeat, the old Sam the killer surfaced. He could end it right here. One pull of the trigger, and the ghost that had haunted him for years would be gone. His daughters were watching. He could see their pale, terrified faces in his mind's eye. He thought of Anna's grave, of the quiet life he had promised her. Killing Silas would be justice, but it would also be a betrayal of that promise. It would make his daughters the children of a man-killer, just as Silas had claimed. With a roar of frustration and grief, he shifted his aim and fired. Not at Silas's chest, but at his shoulder. Silas screamed, the pistol clattering from his nerveless fingers as he collapsed against the wall, clutching his shattered arm. The sound of the shot was still echoing when new lights appeared at the mine entrance, the lanterns of Apache. The visiting marshal, an old acquaintance of Sam's, had been alerted by the sounds of the gunfight echoing through the storm. The climax was over. Silas was defeated not by the killer Sam used to be, but by the father he had become. He lowered the rifle, his body trembling with adrenaline and relief. Rose rushed forward, gathering the sobbing girls into her arms. Their family, forged in fear and tempered by fire, had survived. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, washing the air clean. In its wake, a profound, exhausted quiet settled over the high desert. The marshal and his deputies took Silas Kane and the bodies of his men away, their lanterns bobbing in the pre-dawn gloom, until they were swallowed by the darkness. Silas, delirious with pain, had been ranting about a letter, about a promise to his sister, words that meant nothing to the lawmen, but everything to Sam. Sam rose and the girls rode home in silence, the world painted in the soft gray light of a new day. The cabin, when they reached it, was no longer a fortress, but a sanctuary. It stood whole and waiting, a testament to their survival. Inside, Rose tended to the cuts and scrapes on the children, her hands gentle, her voice a low, soothing murmur. Sam watched her, a deep, quiet gratitude welling up inside him. He walked over to the small wooden box, where he kept Anna's things, and retrieved the last letter she had written, the one he'd never had the heart to read. His hands trembled as he opened it. Anna's familiar script filled the page. She wrote of her fears of her love for him and the girls, and of the lingering shadow of her brother. "If anything should happen to you, Samuel." She had written, "I fear what Silas might do. He twists love into possession. I have written to him begging him to stay away, but I fear he will see it as an invitation. Protect our girls. Don't let his darkness touch them." The truth settled over Sam, heavy and liberating. Silas had lied. The letter wasn't a plea for him to save the girls. It was a warning against him. His entire crusade had been built on a delusional interpretation of his sister's fear. He showed the letter to Rose. She read it, her eyes filling with tears for the woman she never knew, a woman who had fought to protect her family, even from the edge of the grave. "He was a monster," Rose whispered, "but a tragic one." "He was," Sam agreed. "But his story's over. Ours is just beginning." A few days later, after the dust had truly settled, and the four of them walked hand in hand to the creek, to the simple mound of stones beneath the largest cottonwood. The sun was warm on their backs, and the air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. The marshal had returned the silver locket to Sam. It was tarnished, and the chain was broken, but it was whole. Sam knelt by Anna's grave. For years the locket had been a symbol of his loss, a weight of grief and guilt he wore around his neck. Now he understood it differently. It was a symbol of her love, a love that had been strong enough to fight for, strong enough to build a new life upon. With a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years, he gently placed the locket on the large flat stone that served as a headstone. He wasn't burying it. He was leaving it with her, releasing his grip on the pain and keeping only the love. It was a gesture of letting go, of finally forgiving himself. Then Rose stepped forward. She knelt beside him, and from her pocket she took a small object, a little bird crudely carved from a piece of cottonwood bark. It was something her hands had whittled during the long, tense nights of waiting, a small token for the son she had lost. Her own symbol of grief, of a past that could never be reclaimed. She placed the wooden bird gently beside the silver locket. The two objects sat side by side on the stone, one of silver, one of wood. One for a wife, one for a son. They were symbols of two separate, painful pasts, now resting together, brought together by fate and choice. It was a silent acknowledgement that their broken pieces, when joined, made something new, something whole. Sam reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Lucy and Hope moved closer, pressing against them, their small hands, finding purchase on their parents' arms. The four of them stood there for a long time as the sun climbed higher. A new family, their roots intertwined like the cottonwoods by the creek, planted firmly in the red earth, strong enough to withstand any storm.